They were toasting my husband's heir in the living room, their laughter echoing through the mansion my money bought. Only, I was not the one pregnant. I stood frozen behind the oak door, anniversary gift still in hand. I realized my 5-year marriage was not just a lie, but a meticulously staged financial fraud by my own family. They thought I was just a weak heiress who signed checks. They were wrong. I am a senior risk auditor, and I am about to conduct the most devastating audit of their lives. My name is Alara Vance. At 32 years old, I served as the Director of Risk Audit at Orion Dynamics. My entire career was built on the ability to detect anomalies, to see the disaster hiding behind a perfectly polished facade. It is the cruelest irony of my life that while I could spot a decimal error in a ledger from a mile away, I missed the rotting foundation of my own marriage. The drive to the lake house outside Chicago was treacherous that evening. A mix of freezing rain and snow slashed against the windshield, fighting the wipers with a rhythmic thud that matched the anxious beating of my heart. I was driving to my in-laws' 35th wedding anniversary celebration. I had pushed through a grueling week of portfolio reviews just to leave the office by 3 in the afternoon, intending to arrive 2 hours early. I wanted to be the good daughter-in-law. I wanted to help Martha arrange the flowers and set the table, hoping that perhaps, for once, I would see her look at me without that vague shadow of disappointment she usually wore when I was around. I parked my SUV down the gravel drive to avoid the headlights sweeping across the living room windows, wanting to keep my arrival a surprise. In my coat pocket, my fingers curled around a small, heavy velvet box. Inside was the key fob to a vintage convertible Frank had been coveting since the day I met him. It was a $60,000 gesture of goodwill, a bribe for affection that I was desperate to earn. I pulled my coat tighter against the biting wind and entered through the side mudroom, stamping the slush off my boots onto the mat. The house was warm, smelling of roasting meats and the expensive cedarwood candle I had sent them last month. I was reaching for the handle of the inner door when Julian's voice stopped me dead. It boomed from the sunken living room, vibrant and full of a pride I had never heard him direct toward me. He announced that finally, the Thorne family had a true heir. He thanked Sienna for the wonderful gift. My hand froze on the brass knob. Sienna. She was the foster sister, the daughter of Martha's best friend who had passed away. She was always there, at every holiday, every dinner, sitting quietly at the edge of our lives. I leaned in, peering through the sliver of space between the door and the frame. The scene before me looked like a painting of domestic bliss, but the context shattered my world. Julian stood by the fireplace, his arms wrapped tightly around Sienna's waist. She was wearing a cream-knitted dress that hugged the undeniable curve of a pregnancy well into its second trimester. Her hand rested possessively on her stomach. Frank and Martha were beaming, popping the cork on a bottle of Dom Perignon. Martha accepted a glass, her face flushed with excitement. She sighed loudly and said that finally, she did not have to pretend to love that dry Alara anymore. She told them that once I finished the transfer of the trust fund next week, they would finally be rid of me. The room erupted in laughter. It was a sound that stripped the skin right off my bones. Julian kissed the top of Sienna's head and added that I thought he was running a struggling startup. But in reality, he was building a future for his son and Sienna. The velvet box slipped from my numb fingers, but I caught it against my thigh before it hit the floor. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my mind did something strange. It snapped shut. The hurt was there, massive and bleeding, but the auditor in me stepped forward. This was not a marriage. This was a long con fraud. If I walked in there now, screamed, and cried, I would be the hysterical wife. They would gaslight me. They would accelerate their plans. I needed to mitigate the risk. I needed to secure the assets before I let myself feel the pain. I took a slow, trembling breath. I stepped back, placing my feet carefully to avoid creaking floorboards. I retreated into the cold mudroom and out into the biting wind. The snow was coming down harder now, covering my tracks in the yard. I climbed back into my car and let it roll down the driveway in neutral, only starting the engine when I was safely on the main road. As I drove back toward the city, the tears finally came, hot and blinding. But behind the tears, my eyes were wide open. I was not going back to be the victim. I was going back to prepare the audit. The silence of the drive back to the city was heavier than the snowstorm raging outside my windows. As the wipers slashed back and forth, my mind rewound the tape of my life, playing it back not with the soft focus of nostalgia, but with the cold, hard lighting of an interrogation room. I realized I had been the perfect mark. I was 18 years old when my parents, two of the most astute real estate investors in the Midwest, vanished in a plane crash over the Atlantic. I inherited an empire of brick and mortar, a portfolio worth hundreds of millions, and a hollow, aching loneliness that echoed through the empty halls of my childhood home. That was when the Thorns stepped in. They were the neighbors with the warm smiles and the open door. Martha Thorne did not just bring casseroles. She brought the maternal warmth I was starving for. She brushed my hair, listened to my fears, and told me I was part of the family. And Julian was my anchor. He was my first love, the boy next door who swore he wanted nothing to do with my inheritance. He played the role of the proud, self-made man so perfectly. I remembered the night he proposed, telling me he wanted to build a life with me, not my bank account. I believed him. I believed him so much that when he wanted to launch his tech startup, TechNest, I practically forced the seed capital on him, $2 million. It felt like a small price to pay to see him smile. I had been so careful to protect his fragile ego. I let him manage the renovation contracts for my rental properties so he could feel useful, so he could have a secondary income stream that felt earned. I was not supporting a husband, I was feeding a parasite. I arrived at my penthouse in downtown Chicago. I did not collapse onto the floor. I did not scream. I walked straight to my office, the room where I usually analyzed risk reports for Fortune 500 companies. I sat down at my mahogany desk and opened my laptop. My hands were steady as I navigated to the remote security interface for the lake house. I had bought that house. I had paid for every beam and every brick. But I had put the deed in Frank and Martha's names because they had cried about wanting a legacy, a place to call their own in their retirement. The video feed loaded in high definition. I adjusted the volume, the voices from the living room filling my quiet office. The celebration was winding down, but the plotting was just beginning. They were sitting around the fireplace now. Julian was rubbing Sienna's back. On the screen, Sienna pouted, her voice whining through my speakers. She complained that she did not want to wait anymore because her belly was getting too big to hide with loose sweaters. She asked how much longer she had to play the role of the secret lover. Julian kissed her forehead, his voice soothing and terrifyingly pragmatic. He told her to be patient. He explained that I was scheduled to sign the power of attorney for the family trust fund the following week. He said that once I signed those papers, giving him control over the liquid assets, they could move to phase 2. He mentioned my upcoming business trip to Europe in 3 weeks. He said that while I was in London, they would move my things out, change the locks, and file for divorce on the grounds of incompatibility. I watched as Martha chimed in, laughing as she poured another glass of wine. She told Julian to make sure he transferred the renovation funds from my property management account before he kicked me out. She said they needed that money to redo the nursery for the baby. I closed the laptop slowly. The screen went black, leaving me with my own reflection. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a husband stumbling into an affair because he was unhappy. This was a 10-year business plan. They had scouted me when I was a vulnerable orphan, groomed me, married me, and systematically drained me. They looked at me and saw a retirement plan. They saw a golden goose that they were finally ready to slaughter. But they forgot one thing. You do not try to outsmart a risk auditor. You might think you have hidden the paper trail, but there is always a ledger. And I was about to open the books. I slept for exactly 3 hours, which was 2 more than I expected. The next morning, I let the sun climb high into the sky before I picked up my phone. I dialed Julian's number and practiced keeping my voice light, slightly strained, as if I were genuinely unwell. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. "Alara, where are you?" "Oh, Julian, I am so sorry," I said, injecting a note of manufactured disappointment. "The traffic was just horrific with the snow, and I started getting a massive headache. I just turned back to the city apartment to rest. Please tell your parents I am so sorry, but you all go ahead and have a wonderful time without me." I heard it, a small, almost imperceptible sigh of relief on his end. "Oh, no, babe, that is too bad." He lied, his voice instantly becoming smoother, more sympathetic. "Mom and Dad will be so disappointed. It is just family here. You know, really cozy. You would have loved it." "I know. Next time," I said, my voice sweet as poison. "I love you." "Love you too," he replied, and the line clicked dead. I did not waste another second. My first call was to Arthur Sterling, the man who had been my father's estate lawyer and my guardian. He was retired, but he owed my father his entire career, and his loyalty was absolute. "Arthur," I said, "I have a situation. It is a level 10 breach. I need you to activate, quietly." My second call was to Ray, a private investigator who specialized in high-stakes financial fraud. He was discreet, ruthless, and prohibitively expensive. I told him I needed a full surveillance package on Julian Thorne and Sienna Hayes, effective immediately. With the legal and physical surveillance in motion, I turned to what I do best. I became the auditor. I poured a cup of black coffee and opened the encrypted files on my personal server, the ones containing the incorporation documents for TechNest. For the past 5 years, I had respected Julian's privacy, never once looking into the business I had funded. That courtesy was now over. It took me less than 40 minutes to find the first thread. TechNest was a shell corporation. The $2 million I had wired for seed funding had not gone to server farms or employee salaries. It had been routed through a series of LLCs, cleaned, and then deposited into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. An account held jointly by Julian Thorne and Sienna Hayes. The monthly transfers I sent, the ones I thought were topping off his capital for research and development, were following the same path, funding their lifestyle while I funded their cover story. The anger was a cold, sharp blade twisting in my gut. I moved on to the property management files. I pulled the invoices for the renovations on my rental units, the ones Julian was managing to feel useful. I cross-referenced the vendor IDs with state business filings. They were all fake. The addresses were mail drops. The phone numbers were burners. He had been submitting falsified invoices for 5 years, inflating the cost of every repair by 500%. He was not just skimming, he was bleeding me dry. One fraudulent bill for a $2,000 faucet at a time. A secure email pinged in my inbox. It was from Ray. The subject line was "The Office." I clicked it open. The attached images were not blurry surveillance shots. They were high-resolution photographs taken from an adjacent building. Julian and Sienna were not in an office. They were in a luxury apartment overlooking the river, an apartment I had no knowledge of. They were photographed kissing on the balcony, Sienna in a silk robe, Julian in boxers, drinking coffee as if they were a normal married couple. He had been living a double life in a home bought with my stolen money. Another file from Ray followed. It was a data scrape from a private Instagram account under the name Sienna Thorne Soon. My stomach lurched. The account was full of photos of high-end baby furniture, designer onesies, and luxury strollers. I recognized the timestamp on a receipt in one photo. It was from 2 days ago, a purchase from a boutique in the Gold Coast. I opened my credit card statements. There it was, a supplementary card in Martha Thorne's name. A charge for $8,000 at that exact boutique. She was not just complicit, she was an active participant, using my money to shop for her grandchild while planning my exit. The grief I felt in the car was gone. It had been incinerated by a white-hot rage so pure it felt like clarity. This was not a divorce. This was a war. I would not just leave them. I would dismantle them. I would take back every cent they stole and leave them with nothing but the consequences of their greed. I opened a new document. My fingers flew across the keyboard, drafting the most beautiful document I had ever written. It was not a lawsuit. Not yet. It was bait. I titled it the Vance Trust Fund Transfer of Fiduciary Control Agreement. It was exactly what they wanted, filled with complex legal jargon that would make Julian feel powerful, but with loopholes so wide I could drive a fleet of armored trucks through them. They wanted me to sign. Oh, I would sign. I would give them the performance of a lifetime. When Julian returned on Sunday evening, the penthouse smelled of rosemary and roasted lamb. I was wearing a vintage sapphire silk dress, my hair perfectly waved, and a glass of expensive red wine in my hand. I kissed him on the cheek as he walked through the door, smelling the faint, cloying scent of Sienna's vanilla perfume clinging to his cashmere coat. It took every ounce of my willpower not to recoil, but I was no longer his wife. I was an undercover agent in my own home, and the show had to go on. Dinner was a performance art piece. I poured him wine and sighed, letting my shoulders slump just enough to look defeated by the weight of the world. I told him that I was exhausted. I told him that I had been thinking all weekend while he was away, and I realized he was right. I admitted that I was working myself into an early grave for a company that did not appreciate me. I reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the pulse in his wrist. I told him I wanted to quit. I told him I was ready to sign the full power of attorney over to him so he could manage our assets. I painted a picture of us traveling the world, with him in charge of our empire while I finally rested. I watched the greed flare in his eyes like a struck match. He squeezed my hand, his voice trembling with suppressed excitement as he asked if I was absolutely sure. I nodded, giving him a weak, trusting smile. Under the table, I saw the blue glow of his phone screen illuminate his thigh. He was texting her. I knew exactly what he typed without even looking. The fish has bitten. Then I played my second card, the one designed to lower his guard completely. I lowered my gaze to my plate and let my voice break. I told him I had gone to the doctor on Friday. I lied and said the test results were back, and I could not have children. I told him my body was failing me. Julian's face shifted into a mask of practiced sympathy, but I saw the relief wash over him. He did not want children with me. He already had his heir with Sienna. He stood up, walked around the table, and hugged me from behind. He whispered that it did not matter, that we had each other, and that was enough. He even had the audacity to suggest we could look into adoption later, knowing full well he planned to divorce me before the month was out. I wiped away a fake tear and looked up at him. I suggested we throw a party. A grand gala here at the penthouse in 3 weeks to announce my retirement, sign the papers in front of witnesses, and celebrate our new future. Julian agreed instantly. He insisted we invite his parents and, of course, Sienna. He said she was family and would want to support me. I smiled and agreed. It was perfect. He was inviting his mistress to his own execution. In the days that followed, while Julian was busy pretending to work at his fake office, I was executing a financial demolition. I quietly liquidated my high-risk stock portfolios, converting volatile assets into cold, hard cash, which I immediately transferred into secured trust accounts that Julian did not know existed. I stripped the liquidity from our joint accounts down to the bare minimum required to keep up appearances. Then came the masterstroke. I contacted a resort developer I had known for years. I offered him the lake house, the very house Frank and Martha were currently living in like royalty. I sold it to him for a premium price, signing the deed with a clause that required the property to be vacated and handed over in exactly 30 days. They were currently sleeping in a house that I had already sold out from under them. Finally, I turned our home into a trap. I hired a specialist team to come in while Julian was out. We installed pinhole cameras in the crown molding, microphones in the chandeliers, and listening devices in the master bedroom. Every corner of the penthouse was now wired. I was recording every conversation, every phone call, and every whisper. I was building a library of evidence that would ensure that when I finally dropped the hammer, they would never get up again. The stage was set. Now, I just had to wait for the actors to take their places. 1 week before the scheduled party, I staged my departure. I told Julian that the London office needed me to physically oversee the final closing of the books before my retirement could be processed. I packed a large suitcase, kissed him goodbye in the foyer, and took a taxi to O'Hare International Airport. But I did not board a plane. Instead, I circled back and checked into a corner suite at the hotel directly across the street from our building. From my window, with a high-powered telescope, I had a direct line of sight into my own living room. Coupled with the audio feeds from the hidden microphones, I was no longer just watching a betrayal. I was directing a reality show where the contestants did not know they had already lost. It took less than an hour after my supposed flight took off for the invasion to begin. Julian did not just invite them over, he moved them in. I watched through the monitor on my hotel desk as the elevator doors opened directly into my penthouse. Julian walked in first, followed by Sienna, Frank, and Martha. They walked with the swagger of conquerors surveying captured territory. Sienna was the most visceral in her disdain. She walked around the living room, trailing her hand over my furniture. I listened as she stopped in front of the abstract oil paintings my mother had created in her final years. She told Julian that those depressing smudges had to go immediately. She said she wanted to replace them with something modern, something bright for the baby. I gripped the edge of the hotel desk until my knuckles turned white. Those paintings were the only piece of my mother I had left, and this woman wanted to throw them in the trash like yesterday's newspaper. Martha made herself comfortable on my custom Italian leather sofa, kicking her shoes off onto the coffee table. She laughed, a harsh, cackling sound that distorted through the speakers. She said that the stupid girl was finally gone and that this house now belonged to her grandson. She told Sienna to pick out whatever room she wanted for the nursery, as if I were already a ghost haunting the halls. The feed from the master bedroom was the hardest to watch, but I forced myself to keep my eyes open. Julian and Sienna did not hesitate. They defiled the sanctuary of my marriage without a second thought. Afterwards, as they lay in the sheets I had purchased, Julian stroked her hair and made a promise that sealed his fate. He told her that as soon as I signed the papers next week, he would kick me out on the street with nothing but an old suitcase of clothes. He said I would be too broken to fight back. I saved the recording, backing it up to 3 separate cloud servers. That single sentence proved premeditated malice. Later that evening, the microphones in the study picked up a conversation that gave me a weapon I had not anticipated. Frank was pacing back and forth, his voice tight with panic. He was talking to Julian about a debt. It turned out my father-in-law was not just bad with money. He was a degenerate gambler. He confessed to Julian that he owed $50,000 to a loan shark in the South Side and that the interest was compounding hourly. He asked Julian to advance him cash from my accounts the moment I signed the power of attorney. I sat back in my hotel chair, a cold smile forming on my lips. Frank was counting on my money to save his kneecaps. I decided to accelerate his timeline. I used a burner phone to send an anonymous tip to the number Frank had mentioned in his panic, confirming that Frank Thorne was currently hiding out in the penthouse and had no intention of paying. I did not need to get my hands dirty. I just needed to point the wolves in the right direction. While chaos brewed in the background, I met with Arthur Sterling in my hotel suite. We laid out the paperwork on the coffee table. It was a beautiful arsenal. We had the divorce petition filed on the grounds of adultery and fraud. We had the eviction notices for the lake house and the penthouse. We had the criminal complaint for embezzlement regarding the TechNest funds. I looked at the stack of documents, each one a nail in the coffin of the Thorne family legacy. They were downstairs measuring drapes and planning nurseries, completely unaware that the pen had already been lifted, and the sentence was about to be written. My return from London was a day early, according to the flight schedule I had forwarded to Julian. I took a cab from the hotel, but I did not go to the penthouse. I went straight to Arthur Sterling's downtown office. The penthouse was no longer a home, It was a theater, and I refused to step on stage until the curtain call. Arthur had the final report from Ray, the private investigator, waiting for me. Julian, buoyed by the prospect of controlling my entire fortune, had gotten careless. "He's already spending it," Arthur said, his voice grim. He pushed a document across the desk. Julian had just put a non-refundable $100,000 deposit on an 80-foot yacht to secure the bridge loan for the purchase. He had forged my digital signature on a collateral agreement, leveraging my personal stock portfolio. He was moving fast, assuming he would legally control the assets before the bank's compliance department ever reached me. While I finalized the legal strategy, the party at the penthouse had already begun. I pulled up the live feeds on my tablet. Sienna, emboldened by my absence, was holding court in my living room. She was hosting a small afternoon tea for her own friends, showing off the space as if it were hers. I listened, my blood turning to ice, as she laughed and told them Julian was going to let her completely redecorate. She said she could not wait to get rid of the gloomy art and make it a real home for the baby. That evening, I made my call. I dialed Julian, pitching my voice low and exhausted. "Julian, darling," I sighed. "I have the worst news. The London office is a complete disaster. They found an error in the quarterly reports. My flight has been delayed." I heard a sharp intake of breath on his end, a spike of pure panic that he was about to lose his prize. "What delayed until when, Alara? The party is tomorrow." I know, I said, letting a fabricated sob catch in my throat. "But don't worry, I fixed it. I've rebooked. It's a red-eye. I'll land just a few hours before the party. I'll have to come straight from the airport, but I promise I will be there. We can still sign the papers right at the party, just like we planned." The wave of relief in his voice was disgusting. "Oh, thank God, Alara, you scared me. Yes, just get here. That is all that matters. We will handle everything." I knew what this meant to them. My delay gave them one last night of unfettered control. They immediately decided to escalate the event, turning my retirement party into their unofficial coronation. It would be a public debut for Sienna among their inner circle. I watched the camera feed as Sienna walked into my closet. She pushed aside my suits and dresses, finally pulling out the one gown I had been saving. It was an ethereal, floor-length silver dress I had bought for our anniversary, but never had the chance to wear. She put it on. It fit her perfectly. The delicate fabric draped over her swollen abdomen. She stood in front of my mirror, radiant, practicing a smile as the new Mrs. Thorne. While she played pretend, I made my final move. I logged into my primary financial mainframe. I located the supplementary credit cards I had issued to Julian and Martha, the ones with no spending limits. With a single keystroke, I deactivated them both. The fallout was instantaneous. The high-end catering company arrived at the penthouse service entrance to receive their final payment. I listened over the kitchen microphone as the manager ran Julian's black card. I heard the faint beep of the machine, and then the manager's flat voice. "Sir, it's been declined." "That is impossible," Julian snapped. "Run it again." There was a pause. Another beep. "I'm sorry, sir," the manager said, his voice firmer. "It's declined again. Insufficient funds." "It must be a mistake," Julian yelled. "It's an international account my wife is traveling. It probably triggered a fraud alert." The manager was unmoved. I heard him say payment was due on delivery. Then I heard Julian pacing, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper as he called a friend, begging for an emergency bridge loan of $30,000. He promised to pay him back double as soon as the papers are signed tomorrow night. He was borrowing money to pay for his own execution. I closed my laptop and stood up. I had one last set of invitations to send. Julian had often boasted about the partners in his fake company, TechNest. I knew from my audit that these were real, powerful investors I had introduced him to, men he was trying to string along. I sent a personally encrypted email to every single one of them. The message was brief. As the primary stakeholder in TechNest, I am announcing a significant restructuring. Your presence is requested at a private reception tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock sharp. It is imperative you are there to witness the truth of Julian's operations." The stage was set. The trap was baited. The audience was now on its way. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, and the wall of noise hit me first, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of superficial conversations, and a string quartet playing something light and forgettable in the corner. The room was packed. Julian had invited every person who had ever witnessed our perfect life, his extended family, our mutual friends, and, as I requested, the high-profile investors he believed were his future partners. I stepped out onto the marble floor. I had not come from the airport. I had spent the last 2 hours with a professional hair and makeup team in my hotel suite. I was not wearing the rumpled travel clothes Julian expected. I was wearing a floor-length gown of a deep, brutal crimson, my hair pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. I wore the diamond necklace my father had given my mother, a piece I had never let Julian touch. I was not the meek, tired wife they were expecting. I was a queen entering her own court to pass judgment. I saw Julian's head snap toward me. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered, masking his surprise with a look of adoration. He rushed over, kissing me loudly on the cheek. "Darling, you made it. You look luminous." I was so worried. "I wouldn't miss this for the world," I said, my voice clear and carrying just enough to cut through the nearby chatter. He guided me into the room, his hand possessively on the small of my back. I saw her immediately. Sienna. She was standing near the fireplace, wearing my silver gown, her hand resting on her stomach. She gave me a small, timid wave, the perfect picture of the adoring foster sister, the Thorne family, aunts and uncles and cousins. All watched me with the same look, a sickening blend of pity for the barren, workaholic wife and triumphant glee for their family's impending victory. Martha was circling the room like a vulture. I watched her lean in toward one of Julian's potential investors. "She's finally letting go," I heard her whisper, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Julian is just too brilliant to be held back. He'll be taking over everything. It's for the best." "Ilara." Julian's voice pulled my attention. He was standing by the large mahogany desk in the center of the living room. On it, displayed like a trophy, was the fraudulent document, the Vance Trust Fund Transfer of Fiduciary Control Agreement. "Everyone, if I can have your attention." The room quieted. Julian beamed, raising his glass. "My beautiful wife is finally taking a well-deserved rest. We're here tonight to celebrate her, and to celebrate our new future." He gestured to the document. "Darling, if you would do the honors, sign the papers so we can finally be free." A wave of applause rippled through the room. I walked toward the desk, every eye on me. I picked up the heavy, gold-plated pen. I looked at Julian, his face flushed with victory. I looked at Martha, who was already mentally spending my inheritance. I looked at Sienna, who was smiling at her future. I held the pen over the signature line. "Before I sign," I said, my voice ringing out, amplified by the sudden silence, "I have a small gift, a video presentation I put together, just for my husband and his wonderful family, to commemorate all the sacrifices they've made." Julian looked confused, but he smiled, assuming it was a sappy retrospective. I gave a subtle nod to the man I had hired, who stood discreetly by the media controls. The massive 80-inch screen on the far wall, which had been displaying abstract art, flickered to black and then lit up. It was not a slideshow of our wedding. It was the security footage from the lake house, time-stamped exactly 3 weeks prior. The audio was crystal clear. Julian's voice filled his own party. "Finally, the Thorne family has a true heir. Thank you, Sienna, for this gift." The screen showed him embracing Sienna, his hands on her pregnant stomach. It showed Frank and Martha popping champagne. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Before anyone could speak, the scene cut. Now, the footage was from this very penthouse, filmed just last week. The room watched as Martha lounged on my sofa. Finally, her voice echoed. I don't have to pretend to love that dry Alara anymore. Once she transfers the trust, we'll be rid of her. The scene cut again. It was my bedroom, my bed, Julian and Sienna. His voice, smug and cruel. As soon as she signs those papers next week, I'll kick her out on the street with nothing but an old suitcase. The room was utterly, completely silent. The only sound was the faint, tinny music from the quartet, which faltered and then stopped. I watched Martha's face, her triumphant smile frozen, her eyes wide with horror. The champagne flute in her hand slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Sienna screamed, a high, piercing sound that shattered the stunned silence of the room. She scrambled back against the fireplace mantel, frantically pulling the fabric of her stolen silver gown over her stomach as if the silk could hide the truth that was now broadcasting in high definition behind her. Julian's face drained of color, leaving him looking like a corpse standing upright. He lunged toward the control panel, desperate to kill the feed, but he did not make it 2 steps. The head of security I had hired, a man built like a fortress, stepped casually into his path. Julian slammed into his chest and bounced back, stumbling humiliatingly in front of the entire assembly. I lifted the microphone to my lips, my hand steady, my voice calm and terrifyingly polite. I told them that this was the reason I had arrived early at the lake house 3 weeks ago. I explained that what they had just seen was the prologue, and tonight was the final act. I gestured to the screen, where the video feed had been replaced by a spreadsheet. It was a forensic accounting of TechNest. I addressed the room, specifically looking at the investors I had invited. I announced that TechNest was not a company. It was a laundering mechanism. I detailed how $2 million of my personal capital, along with the bridge loans Julian had solicited from many of the people in this room, had been funneled directly into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I pointed out the columns showing the purchase of luxury cars, the rental of the secret apartment, and the deposit on the yacht. I told the investors that their money was not developing software, it was funding a mistress and a fantasy life. The reaction was instantaneous. The polite veneer of the cocktail party evaporated. Several of the investors, men who controlled millions, stepped forward, their faces twisted with rage. They realized they had been played by a man they considered a peer. The reputation Julian had spent a decade curating was incinerated in less than 60 seconds. He looked around the room, seeing no allies, only creditors and enemies. Julian fell to his knees. It was a pathetic, fluid motion. He crawled toward me, grabbing the hem of my dress with shaking hands. He begged me to listen. He stammered that he could explain, that he had been pressured, that he was confused. But before he could finish his lie, a shrill voice cut through his sobbing. It was Martha. She was standing by the buffet table, her face contorted with self-preservation. She pointed a shaking finger at her own son and screamed that it was all him. She claimed she knew nothing about the fraud. She shouted that she was just an innocent old woman and that Julian had done this all on his own. The room watched in disgusted fascination as the mother threw her son to the wolves to save her own skin. I looked down at Julian, then at the stack of papers on the desk, the ones he had been so eager for me to sign. I picked them up and threw them into the air. They fluttered down around him like confetti at a funeral. I told him those were not power of attorney documents. I announced that they were a petition for immediate divorce on the grounds of criminal fraud and adultery, along with a restraining order. Then I delivered the eviction notice verbally. I turned to Frank and Martha, who were huddling together. I informed them that the lake house had been sold 3 days ago to a developer. I told them that the new owners were taking possession in the morning and that anything left inside by noon would be thrown in a dumpster. I looked back at Julian and told him that the locks to this penthouse had been changed 10 minutes ago. I told them they were all trespassing. Sienna sobbed loudly, clutching her belly, trying to regain the spotlight. She wailed that she was carrying the heir to the Thorne family and that I could not be this cruel to a pregnant woman. She asked how I could throw a baby out onto the street. I looked at her with zero emotion. I told her she could keep the baby. I told her she could keep the dress too, because she would need to sell it for food. I leaned down close to Julian's face, so close I could smell the terror on him. I whispered that Julian would not have a single dime to help her raise that child because all his assets were frozen, and he was not going to a nursery. He was going to federal prison. As if on cue, the wail of sirens rose up from the street below, growing louder and louder until the red and blue lights began to flash against the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the room in the colors of emergency. The private elevator doors slid open, but it was not more party guests. It was 2 uniformed police officers, followed by 2 men in dark suits who identified themselves as being from the FBI's white-collar crime division. They moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency that was far more terrifying than any dramatic raid. They already had their target. Julian Thorne, one of the agents said, his voice cutting through the remaining whispers. Julian, still on his knees, looked up like a cornered animal. The agents did not wait for an answer. They pulled him to his feet, spun him around, and cuffed his hands behind his back. The sharp click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room. It was only then that Julian's self-preservation turned feral. He started screaming, not in protest of his innocence, but in blame. He thrashed against the officers, his face purple with rage, pointing a cuffed hand toward Sienna. It was her. She made me do it. She seduced me. She planned all of this. She's the one you want. Sienna, who had been frozen in horror, let out a choked sob. The remaining Thorne family members, aunts and cousins, looked at her not with sympathy, but with sudden, venomous hatred. She was no longer the vessel for their legacy. She was the scapegoat, the comet that had brought ruin to their house. As the officers began to escort Julian toward the elevator, a different kind of chaos erupted near the service entrance. Frank, who had been trying to slip away unnoticed when the sirens started, found his exit blocked by 2 very large men in ill-fitting suits. These were not FBI. These were the men he owed $50,000 to. Going somewhere, Frank. One of them growled, grabbing him by the lapel. Frank let out a pathetic squeak as they dragged him back into the kitchen, the sound of a muffled scuffle and breaking glass underscoring the legal dismantling happening in the main room. I turned my attention to Martha. She was standing alone, her hands clasped over her mouth, watching her son being led away. She looked at me, her eyes finally stripped of all arrogance, filled with a desperate, pleading terror. I walked over to her calmly. I did not raise my voice. I leaned in close and spoke just for her. "You wanted my life so badly, Martha," I whispered. "You wanted the penthouse, the money, the status. Well, you can't have it, but you can have this instead. You can trade my high life for your son's prison life. I hope it was worth it." I turned away from her and signaled to my head of security. He moved toward Sienna. "Ma'am, you need to leave. Now." "I have nowhere to go," she shrieked, clutching the silver fabric of my dress. "It's cold. I'm pregnant." "That is not my problem," I said, my voice flat. "You are trespassing. Get out." My security guard took her firmly by the elbow and began steering her toward the service elevator, past the kitchen where Frank was whimpering, and out into the hallway. Julian heard her cries. He made one last, desperate lunge. He broke free from the surprised grip of one officer and lunged toward me, his face a mask of primal hatred. "You bitch!" he roared. "You ruined everything. He never reached me." The second officer tackled him, slamming him onto my marble floor. They dragged him to his feet. He looked at me, his chest heaving, his expensive suit torn. He was looking for remorse, for pain, for some sign of the woman he had married. He found nothing. He found only me, the auditor, looking at a closed file. He saw the cold, contemptuous gaze of someone who held all the power, someone who had just balanced the books. One of the FBI agents approached me, holding a file. "Mrs. Vance, we have him on wire fraud and forgery. We're ready for your official statement." I took the pen he offered and signed the criminal complaint right there on the desk where Julian had expected me to sign away my life. "There will be no negotiations," I said to the agent. "I want him prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." The guests, horrified and thrilled, began to file out, whispering behind their hands. They left the Thorne family, what remained of them, broken in the middle of the ruined party. Martha had collapsed onto a sofa, sobbing hysterically. I called my household staff, who had been waiting in the library. "Clear the room," I ordered. "Throw out all the food and anything they touched," I said, motioning to the sofa where Martha sat. "I want it gone by morning. Burn it." They nodded, their faces impassive. Within minutes, the penthouse was filled with the sound of plates being scraped and trash bags being filled. I walked alone to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the police cars pulling away, their lights flashing in the dark. I felt the tension of the last 3 weeks, the last 10 years, finally drain from my shoulders. I did not feel joy. I did not feel sadness. I felt the profound, absolute, and total relief of a job finally, completely, done. 6 months passed. The Chicago winter had thawed, and so had I. I was sitting in a new office, one with a better view. The nameplate on my door no longer read Director. It now said Vice President of Global Risk Management. My board had been so impressed with the internal audit I had conducted on my own life that they decided to give me control over the company's. I had, of course, followed the fallout of the party with the same precision I had planned it. Julian, faced with an ironclad case of wire fraud, bank fraud, and embezzlement, had no choice but to take a plea deal. He was sentenced to 8 years in a federal minimum security prison. His appeals were denied. The rest of the Thorne family collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Frank, hounded by the loan sharks I had sicked on him, sold his family home in the suburbs to pay them off. It was not enough. The last I heard, he was living in a motel in another state, hiding under an assumed name. Martha, stripped of her home, her son, and her social standing, was now working as a janitor for a downtown office building. The community she had lorded over had cast her out completely, and Sienna. She gave birth to a baby boy. From prison, Julian refused to sign the birth certificate or acknowledge paternity. She was left a single mother with no education, no money, and no support system. She and Martha now shared a bitter, resentful hatred, each blaming the other for the loss of their golden goose. I sold the penthouse. I could not stand to be in a place so layered with deceit, and I wanted the profit. I took the money and bought a quiet, historic townhouse in Lincoln Park, one with old trees and a small garden. I started dating, slowly. His name was Michael, a human rights lawyer Arthur had introduced me to during the case. It was a relationship built not on desperation or need, but on mutual respect and shared interests. It was quiet, and it was real. I had finally come to understand something my parents had tried to teach me. My value was not in my ability to secure a perfect family. My value was in my strength, my intelligence, and my capacity to protect myself. My loyalty was a resource, not a gift to be handed out to those who only wanted to drain me. Last week, I visited my parents' grave. The cemetery was peaceful in the spring. I laid a bouquet of white orchids, their favorites, on the marble. I told them I was sorry it took me so long to see the risk I was in, and then I told them that their daughter was safe. This morning, I was sitting at a small cafe near my new home, reading a report and enjoying the sunshine. The bell on the door tinkled, and a cold draft blew in. I looked up, and my breath caught. It was Martha, but it was not the Martha I knew. This woman was thin, her hair was gray and stringy, and her face was carved with lines of deep, bitter exhaustion. She was wearing a threadbare coat and staring through the glass at the pastries on the counter, her eyes, full of a desperate, bottomless hunger, drifted and then found mine. She froze, her face flushed with a wave of shame, followed by a flicker of the old, impotent rage. In the past, I would have looked away, embarrassed for her, but I did not. I held her gaze. I did not glare. I did not gloat. I simply looked at her, and then I smiled. It was a small, polite smile. Then I turned back to my report and took a slow sip of my coffee. I let her stand there in the cold, watching me enjoy the life she had tried to steal. I did not need her to suffer. I just needed to thrive. That was, and always will be, the best revenge. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Where are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments so we can chat and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by more people.